Okay, so now today we look at the outcome of Nicholas II's promises as a consequence of the 1905 revolution. We saw that to get his way out of that crisis, he promised he would change and Russia would change. And for many people, they were really happy and delighted at this news. They thought that Russia was going to become a Western-style democracy with its own parliament and democracy, and it was going to on the path to become a modern country like this. But Nicholas II might have been lying just a little bit when he promised all these big changes. So two big changes that he promises are that he'll have a parliament, in Russia they call that the Duma, and that he would go about doing some reforms to what are called Daguerreian Reforms. So like changes to how farming works in the country to benefit the peasants that had been so unhappy with the previous system. So let's just look at both in turn, and then we'll look at one little incident that happens later in 1911 that kind of highlights the failure of Nicholas II to impress his people. So we've got the Dumas to start with, okay? There are 4 Dumas in total, so 4 parliaments. What that means is not 4 physical different buildings with different people inside them. It means the same building, but when a parliament comes together, you say that it is sitting, and then when it's officially cancelled or postponed or broken up, usually for an election to take place, then you say that parliament has ended. So there are 4 sitting parliaments, 4 sitting Dumas during this period. The first and second Duma, they are relatively fair elections. Only a few people are allowed to vote. The wealthy can vote, and that's about it. But even then, they do elect Dumas that are quite radical. So you have these 2 groups that become very important later. One group is called the Cadets, and they are a political party that want change and to modernize Russia. And you have another group called the Socialist Revolutionaries, and these are a bit more radical, and they want Russia to change into a socialist country where the workers have more control, have complete control of the government, and more of a say. So that neither of these groups are communist. We'll look at the Bolsheviks who come later, but they are still very, very radical for the times in Russia. So the Tsar is not very happy. He said, yes, let's have a parliament. Okay, he said, yes, let's have a Duma. Let's go back. He said, let's have a Duma, but they're too radical for him. So he shuts them down. Yeah, he orders his prime minister, guy who's going to become quite important, Peter Stolypin, orders him to shut it down. And instead, they then change the rules of who can vote and how elections are calculated to make sure that these radical cadets and socialist revolutionaries don't win seats. So they basically cheat. They rig the system to make sure these guys cannot get into the Duma. And so therefore the third and the fourth Duma, which are packed full of people that are friendly to the Tsar, that are happy to do what he said, they last a lot longer. For obvious reasons, because the Tsar was happy with what they were doing. So that's the Dumas, basically a bit of a failure. Yeah, they promised to be radical to start with, but very quickly Stolypin shuts that down on behalf of Nicholas II. So his experiment with democracy doesn't really get very far. Yeah. Next thing then, Stolypin's reforms to farming. Now, the peasants, remember this, Russia is predominantly, mostly peasants during this time. Yeah, the average Russian is a peasant farmer. They are not a factory worker. They are not a radical revolutionary with reading their Marxist books. The average Russian works in the fields, away from the cities. And they have had a pretty horrible 100 years, really. Russia was one of the last countries in Europe to get rid of a system called serfdom, where these people were basically little more than medieval peasants, and they couldn't leave their own land. Or sorry, they didn't even have their own land, but they couldn't leave their master's land. So I mean, that's gone, and they've got a slightly better system now. But even so, it's still behind the times, and it's still not very good. And these people are working very, very hard and not making any money out of it. The education levels are almost nothing. Healthcare is non-existent. People get sick and they die quite young. It's not a good life. So they are unhappy and they want change. Stolypin says, right, I'll give you that change. And he sort of has some good ideas. So he gives them the freedom to leave the lands that they're on. They were in a system of communes before. And he gives some of them the freedom to leave those lands and go and start new farms and become family farmers, which, they own their own land, they grow their own crops, they sell them, they make their own profits, and they can keep that. And that's a good idea for many of these farmers. And he tries to give them some land. So he always says two things. He says, you can go off and you can buy your own land. Well, how are they going to buy land? They haven't got any money. So there is something set up called the Peasant Land Bank, which does give them loans. And so some of them can make use of that, but not very many. Only about 25% of the peasants are able to take advantage of this scheme. And some that don't have the money take Stolypin up on an offer to move to Siberia in the north of Russia, and they get given land on the cheap. And 3.5 million people choose to do so. I mean, that in itself is quite telling. Siberia is a pretty cold and nasty place, in many respects. And so for 3.5 million people to think they'd be better off farming in Siberia than they would be where they currently are, that in itself tells you what the peasants were going through. So anyway, it doesn't really work. I mean, Stolypin's dream is that he'll create this new class of middle-class, wealthy farmers in the countryside who will become supporters of the Tsar and supporters of the status quo and not support these calls for revolution. It doesn't happen. It's too little, too late to create any kind of capitalist middle class in the countryside. So that doesn't happen. And so rioting is still taking place. The people are still not happy. The reforms were not a success. And then lastly, just to cap all this failure off, a failed democracy, a failed farming reform, to top it all off, there is something called the Lena Goldfields Massacre, which is in 1911, and you've got miners working in horrendous conditions that go on strike, and they are demanding change. And the Dumas sends one of its men, a member called Alexander Kerensky, who becomes incredibly important to the story of the Russian Revolution later on. But this is his first act in the play, if you like. He goes to the Goldfields Massacre. He writes this report saying how horrible the conditions were for the miners. And actually went back to the Duma, and people read this report, and people became sympathetic to the miners and said, we should be helping these people. Instead, what happens is the Tsar sends the army to stop the protests, and between 200 and 500 miners are killed. People across Russia are very angry with the Tsar, and people are starting to say that the 1905 revolution was completely pointless, that the Tsar basically lied to them, it didn't achieve anything, and this growing feeling of hatred and anger continues to spread throughout Russia. So that's the Russian Dumas, basically a failure. Right, have a go at the two questions there, and then there is a keyword activity on the next slide. Good luck, hope it helps.